And now we're honored to have Dr. Paul Quigley, director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech, and the James I. Robertson Jr., associate professor of Civil War history. Dr. Quigley will speak briefly about the USCT and their place in history. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Paul Quigley.
I heard that word briefly. I thought I was here to give a lengthy lecture. Just kidding. I'm really happy to be here to cheer on and learn more about this remarkable initiative. As a Civil War history professor, honestly, I'm just very happy that people are interested in the subject, and especially when they're interested in shining new light on aspects of the Civil War that have been ignored or overlooked over the years. And that's certainly the case for the stories of these some 200,000 or so African-American men who fought in the Army and Navy for the United States during the Civil War. These charts give you a sense of the numbers involved here. So on the left, you can see African-Americans constituted around 10% of the total number of soldiers fighting for the US during the Civil War. On the right, you see that proportion was even higher for the Navy. So almost 25% of sailors during the Civil War were African-American. So this is a huge deal, a very significant proportion of the military effort for the United States was coming from African Americans, but it's one of those stories or sets of stories that for a long time just didn't get told very much. And I'm very pleased that that's beginning to change, and what's happening here tonight is an important part of that transformation. But it's actually been going on for several decades now, and probably the single biggest cause of this transformation, this new visibility for Black Civil War soldiers, was Hollywood. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the movie Glory, which came out in 1989. And for lots of people, this was the moment where they first realized, hey, African Americans played a vital role in the US military during the Civil War. Denzel Washington, his words are up there on the screen. You all know who he is. And even though he played one of the 54th Massachusetts soldiers in the movie, he says before that experience, even he didn't really know this story. So this is just one example of how much of a revelation Glory was. Sometimes Hollywood gets history right, not always, but sometimes it does good things. Before I get too far into this, and this is going to sound, it's going to feel a little bit like being back in history class for just a minute. I hope that's okay. I just want to kind of announce what my big points are going to be and what I really want you to take away. And the really big story is up there now. The big storyline is that African Americans played decisive roles at every stage of the Civil War. This began before the Civil War, when they actually contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War by enslaved people resisting slavery, running away, forcing white American politicians to grapple with slavery as a political issue. That's what led to the northern and southern states fighting, and that's what led to the outbreak of the Civil War, and it was kind of African American actions that helped bring that about. Similarly, once the war began, they kept up the resistance against slavery. They kept escaping from enslavement. They made it to Union lines oftentimes, and that pressured Lincoln and the Union administration to move in the direction of emancipation policy. So that's another point at the Civil War where African Americans played these critical roles. But the most important one for us tonight happened in the second half of the Civil War, when African Americans in large numbers denied their labor to the Confederate war effort, even though they were enslaved by Confederates, and instead chose to contribute their manpower to the Union war effort, often as soldiers. So that's really the big kind of headline for tonight, is the importance of their efforts in securing Union victory and defeating the Confederacy. So it's a little ironic that when the war broke out, neither side saw black people as important military participants. On the Confederate side, white Confederates looked at African Americans. They saw what they had always seen, a source of enslaved labor to do the work in the fields and elsewhere. And so they kind of enlisted that labor for the Confederate war effort, whether it's growing food or in this image on the screen. I know it's kind of hard to make out the details, but this is African Americans being forced to labor on Confederate fortifications in South Carolina. So really directly contributing to the war effort in that kind of way. The really important point is they did not serve as Confederate soldiers. They were coerced into laboring for the Confederate war effort. Sometimes Confederate officers brought what they call body servants, enslaved African Americans with them to the camps and onto the front. Sometimes black men got tangled up in the fighting in that kind of situation, but they were not, soldiers in uniform officially fighting for the Confederacy. At the very end of the war, you may have heard about this kind of last-ditch effort that the Confederates made in March 1865. Staring defeat in the face, they're going to do everything they possibly can to avoid that. And that's the moment, the only time when Confederates decide, okay, maybe we need to take this step of arming black men and having them fight for the Confederacy. But that was a few weeks before the surrenders, never got off the ground. So the idea of black Confederates is really a myth. On the Union side, we've got a slightly different story, except to begin with, it's not as different as you might think, because at the beginning of the war, Lincoln, the other Union leaders, they're very much focused on preserving the Union as quickly, as smoothly as possible. They don't see the Civil War yet as a fight to end slavery. So they actually see African Americans on the sidelines not playing an important part in this war in 1861 and 62. But gradually, they came to see the benefits and the importance of including African Americans. And one of the most important points is that black people themselves pushed the Lincoln administration to accept their contributions to the Union war effort. So on the one hand, you've got African American leaders like Frederick Douglass from the beginning of the war saying, come on, we all know this is a war caused by slavery. Let's turn it into a war to end slavery. That's the war we want to fight with you. So that's Frederick Douglass and other northern black leaders. In the South, enslaved black people are doing what they've done before the war. They're resisting slavery, they're running away. They're doing it in larger numbers now because the crisis of war, the encroachment of Union troops onto Confederate territory gives them opportunities. So by the end of the war, it's estimated about 500,000 black people had escaped from slavery by their own volition. They tended to present themselves at Union lines, say something like, here we are, we see this as a war that can end slavery, and we want to be part of that. So all of that pressures Lincoln and the Union government to move toward emancipation policy. It's also a question of military necessity, by the way. By 1862, they're struggling for manpower, so the idea of being able to enlist maybe tens, hundreds of thousands of black men to help the fight is very appealing. So January 1st, 1863, we've got the Emancipation Proclamation. We all know that, hopefully, is the document that signals the Union war effort is now going to be, in part, a war to end slavery. There's also a line in there which, often gets overlooked, but is very important for our purposes tonight. There's a line in there that also explicitly welcomes African Americans to participate in the Union war effort. And that's been happening, on an informal basis, the beginnings of enlistment of black men in 1862, but it's really after the emancipation policy that African Americans are welcomed in large numbers into the Union war effort. Now, white Northerners, including Lincoln, of course, are not racial egalitarians. They also don't believe in full racial equality at this point. And so, at least to begin with, African Americans tend to play these supporting roles, similar in some ways to what they were doing in the Confederacy as well. So, doing the kind of manual labor, unloading supplies from ships, cooking, building, repairing railroads, burying bodies and reburying bodies, as in this photo up here. So in some ways, they're performing the same kind of supporting labor as they were for the Confederacy. Only now, the big difference is they're doing it willingly. They want to be doing this. This is their fight. And the even bigger difference is that they're also serving as Union soldiers in uniform, participating in the armed conflict as well. So this is huge. The ramifications of that for the outcome of the Civil War, it helped turn the tide of the war, helped secure Union victory, but also the ramifications for the future ability of African Americans to claim full citizenship after the war really takes off because of the service of these black men. So I've already told you the numbers: 180,000 soldiers, 20,000 sailors. Eventually there were 166 regiments in the United States colored troops. So it's created as a separate organization within the US military. It's segregated, but it allows African Americans into the US Army to fight as soldiers. And of course, if you've heard of one of those regiments, it's going to be the 54th Massachusetts. Their story is dramatized in the movie Glory, but that was just one of 166 of these regiments. So it's a very positive development, and again, far-reaching ramifications for the future. But it's actually kind of a mixed experience, at least to begin with. If you think about what that meant for black men to be fighting in these US uniforms as soldiers, for Confederates, this was going against everything they believed in, going against white supremacy, against the system of slavery. And so Confederates' response to this, at the highest level up to the Confederate president, was to say, black soldiers will be treated as if they're escaped slaves. And what that means is that we'll either execute them or we'll re-enslave them. And that was the official Confederate government policy. So that elevates the risk, the danger that these guys are taking when they take the field. For the black soldiers themselves, military service could be and often was very empowering. This was the way they proved their status as U.S. citizens eventually. But it was also challenging at times as well because of ongoing racial inequalities even in the northern United States. And what happened there was black soldiers to begin with were paid less than white soldiers. They were often not given the opportunity to fight in actual combat. They were relegated to supporting roles, to manning garrisons and even building fortifications, that kind of thing. Not given the opportunity so inequality was built into this system from the beginning. And there was also a lot of skepticism from white northerners. Could black people make good soldiers? A lot of white northerners still thought no. So black soldiers had the onus on them to prove that wrong. And that's what they did on the battlefield. Over time, when they were allowed opportunities, like at Fort Wagner, again to bring it. So black soldiers had the onus on them to prove that wrong. And that's what they did on the battlefield over time when they were allowed opportunities, like at Fort Wagner, again to bring in the Glory movie. Black soldiers were able to prove that they were every bit as good as white soldiers on the battlefield. And so by the end of the war, people generally recognized their abilities. And after the war, even though all of the volunteer regiments that had been created during the war disintegrated, the US military actually created 6 permanent regiments of black soldiers in 1866, and these went on to become the Buffalo Soldiers, who are kind of legendary for their service out in the West. So that was kind of the next chapter of black military service after the war. So, great success story, which makes it surprising that in the way people tended to remember the Civil War, in the way people commemorated the Civil War, when they wrote the history books, when they erected the statues, African American soldiers were typically left out. So there's only a few examples that I think this project takes the baton from and picks up the mission of. And one of the early examples is this. You may have seen this one on Boston Common. This is the monument to the 54th Massachusetts there. That was erected in the 1890s. A century later, in 1998, this one came up in Washington, D.C. It's the African American Civil War Memorial. And most recently, there's the Emancipation Proclamation and Freedom Monument, which was installed just in 2021 in Browns Island, Richmond. And this actually commemorates a number of different black Virginians who made contributions of various kinds to Virginia history, including Sergeant William Carney, who was in the 54th Massachusetts. He was the color bearer at Fort Wagner, and a real American hero. He was the first African American awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Fort Wagner. So there are these beginnings, but these are definitely the exceptions. For the most part, African American soldiers have been overlooked in the commemorative landscape of the American Civil War, and I feel really privileged to be here in Franklin County to see, I think, history being made with this project, which I think is going to be the start of a new phase of Civil War commemoration. So thank you very much for including me.